Hi, and welcome back to the Downhome Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Witten, and joining me is Heather Stemp. For Downhome Magazine's June issue, she wrote Amelia Earhart in Newfoundland, the first installment of a series of articles focused on this aviation pioneer. On June 4th, 1928, a Fokker 7 seaplane landed in Trepassey. There was a pilot, a mechanic, and one passenger who'd been selected to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, Amelia Earhart. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, and such a fascinating topic. What really struck me, in 1928, Amelia Earhart wasn't a household name. She was a social worker in Boston who was fascinated with flying. Can you tell me a bit about how Earhart found herself the passenger and the captain in this historic flight?
Well, that is the interesting part. What we know is what we see in the headlines. And so we know in 1928, she flew across the Atlantic with two gentlemen, Spouts and Gordon. And we don't know those intriguing backstories. And that's the type of research I had to do for the first two articles. I'm going to explain my personal interest in Amelia, but it didn't begin with the Trepassey story. I think the most fascinating part of that story for me was that Amelia wasn't supposed to be on that plane at all. Mm-hmm. It was just pure luck that a social worker, as you said, from Boston, who was interested in flying, ended up in that final seat on the Fokker triplane Friendship. The woman who wanted to go on the flight was Amy Phipps, and she was married to she was wealthy in her own right, but married to a wealthy Brit named Frederick Guest. And she'd had lots of adventures throughout her life, and she decided she wanted to be the first woman to fly the Atlantic. So she made all the arrangements for the pilot, the mechanic, and then she was going to be the third person. Well, her family put up such a fuss that she finally consented to finding a replacement for her. And because she was American, she wanted the first woman to cross the Atlantic to be an American. And she actually set out specific criteria for the type of woman that she wanted to take her place. And that's how Amelia was found. Her lawyer, Amy Phipps, Guest's lawyer, went looking for a young flyer. He made contact with George Putnam and Hilton Rayleigh, and it was through Hilton Rayleigh that the name Amelia Earhart came forward, because he was part of the aviation scene in Boston back in the 1920s. So it was all a huge accident that Amelia ended up on the plane, and there were so many spots in the story where she may not have been chosen, her name may not have been mentioned, that the whole story just swings on a note of fate.
Yeah, she went on to be such a household name. You know, so many books have been written about her and her accomplishments, but it could have been someone else, or we may have not had that kind of history.
Exactly. And what I mentioned in the two Trepassey articles is that there were other female aviatrix around at the time. The person who put Amelia's name in the forefront was George Palmer Putnam, who was one of the first people to interview her for the last seat on the Friendship in 1928. He became her husband in 1930, and he was a master at public relations. He was a book publisher. He knew how to interest people in writing books, and then he knew how to sell not only the books, but the people themselves. And so it was through the combination of her personality, sense of adventure, background in flying, and his experience in promoting people and books that put her name at the forefront. Out of Trepassey, there were two other female pilots that were planning to take off at almost the same time. Thea Rasch, who was German, and Mabel Bohl, who was an American. And the same thing happens in the article that I'm working on now, which is her flight out of Harbor Grace in 1932. There were three other women who were planning to fly the Atlantic at exactly the same time as Amelia. And you just don't know their names because they didn't have that publicity machine behind them that Amelia had in her husband, George.
Yeah, but it's also so interesting because, you know, how Putnam and Earhart played it is they kept it so secret. Like,
yes.
They did not announce it because, you know, Bohl and Rasch were kind of hot on their heels and it could have, you know, outstripped them and, you know, got ahead of them. There was so much secrecy of getting to Newfoundland and then, you know, the cat was out of the bag.
Exactly. And this is the same story in the third article, which is coming out in August, where she's where she's planning the transatlantic flight. The other three have declared their intentions and gained a lot of press just on their preparation and so on. Amelia already had that experience, and she knew how draining it could be to deal with reporters and stories and all the other details that can arise out of publicity. And so she was keeping a low profile for two reasons. A, she didn't want the other three to get a jump on her when she left Harbor Grace on May 20th, 1932. But she also didn't want to sap her energy. She wanted to stay focused on the planning and the implementation of the flight. So it's very interesting to hear about the intrigue behind these stories that I, for one, didn't realize was there. I just thought, oh, well, Amelia's the only woman who wants to do this, when in fact that's not true at all.
Right. It's just when we go through the history books, we get the dates and the accomplishments, but not always the build-up and what could have happened, how history almost went sideways.
Yes, exactly.
And I want to talk about the 1928 Trepassey trip because Newfoundland it has such a rich history when it comes to aviation history because we were the last stepping point for North American travel to Europe.
Exactly.
But we don't always think of little Trepassey had such a role to play.
Yes. Interestingly, Trepassey was chosen not by Amelia nor the pilot or co-pilot. It was chosen by Commander Richard Byrd. And he's the one for whom the plane they used was intended. And he decided it wasn't exactly going to meet his needs for his next expedition. So the plane became available. And that's where Amy Guest, or Amy Phipps Guest, heard about a plane being available that was capable of flying the Atlantic. So when the planning was being done with absolutely no information, first-hand information, they went back to Commander Byrd. Now, he had experience flying a Fokker 7 tri-motor plane, and so when they when Amy took over ownership of the plane, she also engaged Richard Byrd to advise her on her flight. In retrospect, when they had so much difficulty because of weather and other sea conditions, getting the seaplane off the water, they realized that the trust they had in Commander Byrd's experience probably wasn't as sound as it should have been. Because although he was an explorer, he wasn't an aviator. And so he was only giving them his experience. But in fact, it hadn't been the greatest flight anyway, but he had no other information to give them. So the fact that they flew out of Trepassey was fateful as well, because everyone else at that time trying to make flights were using land planes. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that Commander Byrd's experience with Trepassey and with the seaplane is the one that framed that first flight across the Atlantic by a woman.
Yeah, and they were stuck there for like 2 weeks waiting for
Yes.
weather and getting
Yes.
a good report.
Yeah.
And if Earhart hadn't been able to make this kind of record, maybe that would have been the end of her aviation career.
Oh, absolutely. At any point, if another woman had beaten her to that specific record involving the crossing of the Atlantic, in spite of all of George's skill at public relations, no, her name wouldn't be known. The other woman's name would be known for sure. And it's very interesting, and it must have been terribly stressful for them. Sitting in Trepassey, not able to get off the water with this heavy seaplane, knowing that Thea Rash and Mabel Bowl were in land planes and weren't going to run into the same problems, and that the other two, like them, were just waiting for the weather to clear, and then it was just hours that would determine who would get the record. And then, of course, hours over the Atlantic, because there had been a number of crashes and deaths, especially by women, before Amelia finally made that flight out of Trepassey.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
And
I'm always happy to talk about Amelia.
Looking forward to the next articles in the series.
Thank you so much.
Downhome Magazine's June issue is out now, so you can pick it up and read Heather Stemp's article, Amelia Earhart in Newfoundland. And keep an eye out for future issues of Downhome Magazine, where Heather follows Earhart's time in Trepassey and news about her competition. Thanks for listening.